Hi there, Shanna Kramer here with Creatively Uncorked, and in this lesson we are going to cover watercolor basics. This is where you start when you're ready to get started with watercolor, and we've been sending out watercolor lessons with our Creative Box Live subscription for the past couple of months. And if you are new to watercolor, start here before diving into the lessons. This will get you a long way toward getting finished. Today we are going to cover, first of all, our tools. We'll cover palettes, brushes, paint consistency, how to mix your paint, how much water to add to your paint. We'll cover how to make a wash, and then different techniques of painting, including wet on dry, wet on wet, and dry on wet. All right, let's take a look and get started. First thing we're looking at is our tools. For example, here I have a standard hardboard, or masonite it's also called. And you can get this at any hardware store. You can get them in art supply stores. They work pretty well. It's not the only thing that you can tape your paper to, but it works well. Okay, so then I have my paper. This paper that I'm using today is Arch's 140-pound cold press, which is my favorite paper. And if you get your art kits from Creatively Uncorked, this is what we send you. It handles washes great. Not all paper does that. So if you're struggling with your washes, and if you're struggling with the paper or with the water pooling on your paper, you might just need to upgrade your paper. Tape. You don't have to tape your paper down, but it really helps, especially if you're doing a large wash over the whole thing. Another thing your tape is handy for is just putting that under your board to keep your board at a tilt. Whenever we're working with water, gravity is our friend. Okay, another couple of things that you might want would be some kind of spray bottle. Not necessary, but it really does help when you're trying to activate your paints. Instead of using your brush to drop water on each one, this is a lot faster. If you got your paints from Creatively Uncorked, we sent you out a starter set, which is a Prang watercolor set, 16 colors. You can get these at most art supply stores, so they'll also come with a brush that's approximately this size, but this is not the right brush. This is not the brush that came with it. I don't have mine anymore. This is the brush that we sent out with your art kits. This is a Grumbacher number 14 Golden Edge Round. And you don't have to have this exact brush either. You can use some of the other brushes we sent out with your kits. Those are acrylic brushes mainly, but you can use them for watercolor. They just aren't going to be the best at it. Your watercolor brushes, never use them for acrylic. You can use acrylic brushes for watercolor, but you cannot use watercolor brushes in acrylic. Okay, so this pan that we sent you, this watercolor set that we sent you, these are dried colors in pans. So you do have to activate them before you begin, just by spraying them with water. Try to spray them about 10 minutes before you start painting. Another type of palette I'll cover here is, so this is when you're ready to advance and start purchasing your own colors, paints that come in tubes similar to this. You just squeeze out the tubes into the pans, and you can either let them dry, which is what I do, and then I take these pans with me when I'm traveling because I do a lot of painting outside. So I let them dry first so it doesn't make a mess. And you can choose any colors and you can make up your own palette this way. We send out these pre-made palettes for you because once you get into purchasing watercolor pans, there are hundreds, possibly even thousands of colors, different brands, different things that you need to know about your paint before you can start mixing them together. This is one good way for beginners to get started. I'll post a link to this particular palette. This is one I really like a lot because I just sprayed water in there, so I'm not going to tilt it too much, but it clasps shut and it's airtight, watertight. So if somebody shakes this thing around, if I toss it in my bag and just carry it with me, everything in here might spill, but it won't leak out. Okay, there are a lot of palettes on the market that claim to be waterproof. They lie. This one is actually waterproof. I have several of these. Like this, this was my Brights palette. So I just have a few different palettes and I just name them in a way that I can remember. One benefit of this palette is it's got this extra tray that pulls out. Okay, so you can use this for an additional mixing tray. You can use this for a mixing tray. Or instead, what I did is just put some watercolor paper in there. And this was just like the back of an old painting. So just fit some watercolor paper in there, just taped it, no big deal. And then I can go around with all of these colors and just add little samples over on this side and write the names of those colors. And that's something that's very helpful when you're just starting out with watercolor, when you're just starting out with tubes of watercolor, so you can keep track and remember which colors you have in your pan, because it's not always that easy to remember. And then you could just put this tray back in there. You can use this as a mixing well and see the names of your colors as well. Brushes. I have quite a few brushes. The ones that you'll have for starting out with, if you get your supplies from us, are these two. There's a small round and a medium round. Okay, these are decent. They're okay. They're pretty okay brushes. They should last you a while. Once the tips start getting dull, probably time to replace them. Watercolor brushes are significantly more expensive than acrylic brushes, and with good reason. They really are the only thing that works. So these two are rounds. So these round brushes, you can get a fine tip, at least on a new brush, and they do hold a decent amount of water. You can paint with the side of the brush to get a wide line, with the tip of the brush for a thin line. And if you get a decent enough round brush, you can do your whole painting with a round. You want to make sure it holds the water, so if you have it full of paint and then you start painting with the tiny edge of the tip, you want to make sure that the water stays in the brush reservoir instead of falling all out onto your paper. So that's one thing to look for when you're looking for watercolor brushes. A few others I'll show you. Here's another big fat round. And this one, let's see, this is a number 16. I have done entire paintings with this, even the detail. Here's a flat. This is a gigantic flat. This is a 1 1/4 inch, so pretty big brush. And this you can use to cover your entire paper with water. And this is a wash, basically, when you cover it with water or you cover it with a couple of different colors. And this is the brush that will do that for you. There's a small flat. And the small flat, you can just do little tiny details. I know people that paint whole things like with their flats. Some people prefer rounds, some people prefer flats, but this is going to get you a little bit more detail. Let's see, that covers most of them. I have a few more rounds and flats. There's also this liner brush, and you can get liners of different sizes. This is a number 4, but some of them have really long bristles, some are shorter bristles. And this is for doing little fine detail work and little scribblies. So if you're doing a power line, that could work really well, or some tree branches, maybe some little insect legs, some maybe reflections. So that's when this little tiny liner brush will come in handy. For caring for your brush, you don't want to leave these sitting in your water. You rinse them out when you're done using them and just set them aside. You can use soap on them when you're done. It's not really even necessary. If you rinse all of the paint out of them, it should be just fine. You don't want to let them sit in the water, though. All right, and then we're going to go ahead and start working with our paint. So paint consistency, this is really pretty important. And this is something that, I don't know why, but not a lot of watercolor teachers will explain this to you right up front. But it's the most important lesson in mixing your watercolor paint. This is it right here. This is what you need to get you started in watercolor and to help you more than anything else. So the different consistencies of paint are tea, coffee, milk, cream, and butter. With each of these, I'm going to take a pretty good fat brush here and mix up some paints. I'll just mix up some colors that I have here. How about a nice purple? Okay. So I have this pretty thin here. A lot of water, little paint. You can see through it easily. Okay, and that is tea. All right, moving on. We'll take a look at the coffee consistency. And coffee is going to be darker. It'll still be a little more fluid. I'm going to leave a gap between my tea and my coffee there so they don't bleed together. So it's a little bit darker, but you can still see through it. All right. So when we get on to milk then, I'll take a lot more paint here. Add some water. So milk consistency, you're looking for something that is semi-transparent and it's full strength color. Load up a little more paint there on my brush. Okay. So semi-transparent, you can still see the word milk, it's just not as obvious. All right, so cream, going back into my purple here, and I'm just picking up this water's been sitting in here for a little while. It's pretty darn thick, so I'm pretty much taking that water right straight out of the pan. And these were dried paints. These were not tube paints. These were tube paints that were dried out, okay? So not fresh tube paints. Here's cream. Ooh, I touched the milk right into that. Look at how that's bleeding. Oh, that's okay. Okay, so cream, you can't really see through it. It's pretty much opaque. It's not going to move around much. Butter is not a consistency that we can get with dried out paints. To get butter paint, you have to really use something that's fresh from the tube. And I know I can't do that. I'll just try to fake it here. There, kind of. So it'll be thicker than this and right out of the tube. So that is butter. All right, so once you have your colors down, then the next step is mixing them. So you can mix these colors. You can mix, if it's down lower on this list, you can mix it into the ones above it, but not the other way around. So if I was to take tea colored paint right now and put it into the cream, it would turn into a big cauliflower bloom. But if I take cream and mix it into the coffee, or the tea, and the tea's starting to get kind of dry now, so you can see that it's staying pretty much in place. In the coffee, you can see that it is blending. Yep, and this will fuzz out too, and this will blend too, but it's probably not going to get the cauliflower. And I can put cream into milk, and that'll fuzz out again, but it won't leave any bad marks. So this is how you do your color blending. You first lay down a thinner color, usually tea or coffee, and then you add heavier colors, which would be milk, cream, or possibly even butter. But these four are going to be the main ones, and if you're using a dried palette, they'll be probably the only ones you can do. Okay, moving on. Next thing I want to do is a wash. All right, so I'm still tilting my palette up. I'll just do this. Let's see. Maybe I'll try a slightly different brush here. Maybe I'll try this big fat wash brush. So when you're doing a wash, you need to decide which colors it's going to be and mix those colors in advance. So I'm going to take this nice orange here, which is about a coffee consistency. And I've got my purple there, which is pretty darn close to a coffee consistency. Yeah. And how about what the heck, how about a nice turquoise blue? Add that to my purple, get it somewhat of a coffee consistency if I can. Add more water as necessary. If you're using dried paints, you're going to need to add water to them frequently. Keep your paints active. Keep them awake. All right, so now we've got a blue purple, we've got a purple, we've got a bright orange. And should we try another one? Maybe a nice, ooh, what's this? Permanent gamboge. Lovely. Like it. All right. So downside of using a big fat brush and a little tiny palette, you're going to pick up more than one color at a time. Or maybe that's an upside. Who knows? So when you're doing your wash, you want to have a tilt, start top to bottom. Okay. Always. Because when you're working with your paint, you're going to end up with a bead of paint. And what I mean by that is this water is going to run down. You see how it's dripping down? Gravity, our friend. And it's creating a bead of paint down here. All right, so you can't go back up and paint down here. You have to paint with the bead. You're leading with the bead. Okay, so maybe right below that bead, I'll do another one. And you have to do this before it dries out so you don't get a line. Going into the next color now. One trick is your paint consistency has to be equal. A little bit more of that reddy orange there. And just keep moving. Don't stop. Okay, I'll take a little purple next. Ooh, orange and purple usually look pretty good. A little better than this. That's okay. I'm getting a nice blend from one color to the next. Then I'll come and pick up that blue. Lovely. Okay. So I think I must have gotten a drop of water right there, so you can see how it's clearing away the background color. Had a drop of water over here too, and you can see that it cleared away the color there pretty well too. So when you see this happening, I have water pooling on top of that tape, as well as collecting down here where the tape and paper meet. So keep an eye on that. As your wash is drying, you want to keep an eye on that because one thing that water will do is get under your tape. And then when you don't want it to, it's going to come back out from under your tape and cauliflower up your paper. Okay, now this, okay. But mostly you leave it alone. So this little drop right here, that's not fixable now. So that's going to have to be a sun or something. Yeah, you can't go back and retouch your washes and make them work again. It's just, you have to stop and leave them alone. Okay, so I've got a nice gradation of color here. Maybe could have gotten a little bit more even color here, but I'm just going to let that go. But yeah, and then you have to mix your paints initially the correct thickness. So in this case, we were going with coffee, roughly. And could I have gone with something more like cream? That would have been a pretty thick milk. Probably would have been a nice, beautiful sunset, rich sunset that we didn't have to go over multiple times. So that is a wash. All right. Now we're going to talk about some different techniques of painting. Wet on dry, and dry on wet. So since we have this wet right now, let's start with the wet on wet. So I'm taking a thicker paint. Remember, it's got to be thicker than what you're painting into. So this is approximately cream or milk and cream. Okay, and now it's bleeding into that undercolor. All right, so that is somewhat wet on wet. Okay, you could go a lot farther than that. You could just keep adding color into color. Just remember that the color you're adding has to be thicker than the color you're adding it to. That is the trick. Okay, so that's wet on wet. Wet on dry is literally when you take wet paint and you apply it to dry paper. That's how you get straight lines. That's how you get sharp edges. We add a little fun color to that. Okay, so that is wet on dry. And then there's dry on dry, which again is going to be slightly more challenging with our pre-dried paints. But I'll just pick up a color here, a pretty thick color. Okay, and then to dry that, I'm just holding it on my paper towel. Just hold the brush onto the paper towel for a few seconds. And what that's going to do is just soak up the water and leave the paint behind. most of the paint anyway. But notice I'm holding it at the base of the bristles, not up at the top. I'm not soaking it all up. So now I've got some paint on my brush that's pretty not wet. Maybe leaving it a little too dry. Okay, I'll try that again with soaking up a little less water. Okay, try it again. So you've probably seen this technique a couple of times where you have maybe have sparkles across the water, something like that, or tree bark. And this is the dry on dry technique. So there we go, wet on wet, wet on dry, and dry on dry. All right, well, that should help you out with the basics of getting started with watercolor. And when we are discussing these different techniques that we are using in our paintings, you can always refer back to this video if you have trouble remembering or need a refresher. And I hope this helps a lot. I'll see you next time.